Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the ICG's Digital Academy webinar series. I'm Sally Alsop, the ICG committee member responsible for running our webinar programme. Right, I can't actually see my slides at the moment, so I hope you can. Lucy, could you just confirm what you can see?
You can just see the front slide, Digital Academy.
Yeah, perfect. Okay. So today's webinar is about the application of behavioural science within quantitative research. And for this, we're delighted to welcome back ICG member Chris Harvey. Chris is the founder of Activate Research, which inspires change and drives growth through enabling a deeper understanding of how people think and why they behave the way they do. Drawing on an MSc in behavioural science and 15 years research industry experience, Activate Research adds complementary insights and approaches from behavioural science and psychology more broadly to agencies' research offer. This enables end clients to better understand, predict and influence target audience behaviour. During this webinar, Chris will talk to us about the huge opportunity that exists for clients to improve their ability to understand, predict and influence key stakeholder behaviour through the application of behavioural science insights and approaches to quantitative research. During his webinar, Chris will share both theory and tools for this, looking at behaviour change models, behavioural economic approaches and personality trait insights. The webinar will also summarise highlights from his more detailed new 35-page guide, Applications of Behavioural Science to Quantitative Market Research, which he will provide the link to at the end of his talk. Chris is happy to take questions at the end, so please type your questions into the chat box as we go along, and I will read them out at the end. We're really grateful to Made in Studios for sponsoring this webinar. Made in Studios is an MIS group brand offering the most modern and stunning viewing facilities in Birmingham and across France in Paris, Lyon and Lille. Before I hand over to Chris, here are some more webinars and events we have planned for you over the autumn. You can see it's a packed agenda. So don't forget that we're able to offer great value sponsorship opportunities with each of our webinars. Sponsorship normally costs £120 for a lot of exposure on our website, mailers and social media, and of course on the day. So please contact Lucy if you'd like to know more about sponsorship opportunities for any of these activities. So our speaker today is Chris Harvey, founder of Activate Research, and I'll now hand over to Chris. If I can find you.
Thanks very much, Sally. Right.
Hang on a second. Change presenter. There we go. Fantastic, that's great. I'll put myself on mute. Over to you, Chris.
Great stuff. So thanks very much, Sally, and welcome everybody to today's talk on applications of behavioural science to quantitative market research. Sorry, just a second. I think I seem to have lost I can't actually see my slides anymore.
So we can see them.
If helpful, I can share them.
It might help if you were to turn off your webcam, Chris. Try turning off the webcam and then seeing if you can pull your.
There we go.
Is that better?
I can see it now. Right, I gather all of you could have seen it anyway, so apologies about that. So thanks very much, Sally, and welcome everybody to today's talk on applications of behavioural science to quantitative market research. Before I start, I just wanted to say thank you to everybody for joining today. No doubt everybody is extremely busy, and I'm really grateful for you for sharing an hour of your time with me today. So I guess the basic sort of backdrop, if you like, to today's talk is that quite a lot has been done over the last decade or so in terms of translating insights and approaches from behavioural science into qualitative market research. However, a fair amount less has been done in quantitative market research, and this is the particular area I'm going to focus the next sort of 45 minutes or so on today. Very brief introduction, because Sally obviously gave a quick rundown to me. Anyway, so I'm Chris Harvey, I'm founder of Activate Research, and I've been in the research industry around about 15 years or so. I think pretty much everything on this slide in terms of what I do, we covered in the intro. I guess just a couple of things to mention briefly. So I tend to work most typically, although not always, with research agencies. And I work quite a lot in health, not exclusively in health, but a lot of the examples I'll talk through today are focused on health or pharma, if you like. But the methods they're illustrating are very much applicable across all sectors. And it's also worth just briefly mentioning, so Sally mentioned I did a master's a few years ago in behavioural science, and I guess everything I'm going to talk through today is very sort of grounded in academic research. So my kind of, I guess one of my kind of key aims, if you like, has been to bring back the most relevant and actionable information and approaches from academia into the real world. So without further ado, let's get started. So today's session is going to be in 5 parts. So first of all, I'm going to do a brief introduction where I first of all define behavioural science, but then talk about a couple of very specific key insights and associated challenges that we face when trying to bring insights and approaches from behavioural science both into qualitative and quantitative market research. Having kind of set up those couple of challenges, I'm then going to talk through 3 main sections which illustrate how quantitative research in particular can best tackle these 3 challenges. So the first key area I'm going to talk about is behaviour change models. Now, behaviour change models are used quite a lot in health and in social research and various other sectors. And effectively, behaviour change models, they do what it says on the tin. They help you to come up with strategies to change behaviour. However, many of the better behaviour change models also include a sort of preliminary aspect where they provide a very useful structural framework to help us investigate what's currently going on in a particular situation. So even if our ultimate end goal is not particularly to change behaviour, behaviour change models can help us to hypothesize about many different aspects that might currently be driving behaviour in a particular situation. So that's the first key section. The second key section I'll talk through is behavioural economics. Now, I'm guessing probably of the 3 areas I'm going to talk through today, behavioural economics is probably the area that people have had the most exposure to, and perhaps particularly in the qualitative space. However, I would also guess that in the quantitative space, people's experiences and knowledge are perhaps slightly less full than they are in the qualitative space. And then the last key section I'm going to talk through is around personality psychology. So this is a really interesting area. This is all about how, if we can get a flavour of people's general traits, how they are as a person in general, this can help us to better understand their behaviour in any particular situation. I'll end up with some concluding thoughts and hopefully sort of 5 minutes for Q&A at the end. And I guess before I get started on all the detail, and there is quite a lot of detail to go through today, I just wanted to mention that everything I'm going to talk through today is complementary to existing quantitative research, data collection methods and approaches. So there's nothing here I'm going to talk through today that involves significant investment in technology or anything like that. This is all going to be things that fit nicely into our existing quantitative approaches. Right, so without further ado, let's get started on what behavioural science actually is. So I guess in times of what seem like ever decreasing trust in our political establishment, I'm sort of taking you back to 2015 and a former leader of the US, Obama, and he said back then, a growing body of evidence demonstrates that behavioural science insights, research findings from fields such as behavioural economics and psychology about how people make decisions and act on them, can be used to design government policies to better serve the American people. And there's a couple of reasons I put this particular slide up as an intro. The first one is I think Obama has a very nice and concise and usable definition of behavioural science. So this thing about how people make decisions and act on them is a concise definition that I tend to use quite a lot of the time when summarising what behavioural science is. The second key reason I put this quote up here is that how people make decisions and act on them, that sort of description of behavioural science seems to have a lot of relevance and a lot of promise with regards market research. So obviously as market researchers, we spend a lot of our time trying to work out how people make decisions and act on them. And so I guess at first glance, it seems that there's quite a lot of potential for behavioural science in market research. However, if we start to kind of get down amongst the weeds and look at some of the detail of the fields that Obama talks about, like behavioural economics and psychology, we actually find that it's not really incredibly straightforward to start applying behavioural science, as I say, to qualitative or quantitative research. And there's a couple of key insights and key challenges that I want to sort of pose first of all before I get into those three key areas I mentioned earlier. So the first sort of key insight from behavioural science is that human behaviour is often complex, and it's often more complex than we might like to believe. It can also be surprising, and we can also seem to make what seem to be sometimes illogical or even irrational judgments or decisions. So to give you an illustration of what I mean by this, I'm going to show you a study that was done about 10 years ago by Prospects and YouGov. And so it goes like this. So first of all, they asked a sample, a NatRep sample of 2,000 people. The BBC licence fee costs £145.50 a year. Is this good or bad value for money? And as we can see on the left-hand side, around about 1 in 4 said it's good value for money. Pretty much, yeah, exactly twice that, just over half said it's bad value for money, and the remaining 19% are sitting on the fence. Now, if this was a sort of typical study, and for example, the BBC was our client, then we might go back to them and say, you know, look, you're in quite a lot of trouble, really. Effectively, only 1 in 4 people think your license fee represents good value for money. However, this study didn't stop there. It asked the same question in a very slightly different way. So the second part of the study was again asking a separate but also nationally representative 2,000 online sample, the same question, but framed not in terms of the cost per year, but in terms of the cost per month. And what we'd expect, if people were completely unsurprising and rational at all times, would be that we'd expect the results to be very, very similar, or indeed exactly the same. However, what we get on the right-hand side when we look at this is that when we frame it in cost per month as opposed to cost per year, the percentage saying it's good value for money goes up by 10%, from 27% to 37%. And similarly, the bad value for money goes down from 54 to 44%. And based on the kind of, as I say, 2,000 samples, these are, you know, really highly statistically significant swings. So this is all very interesting, but why am I showing this? What has this got to do with behavioural science and market research? Well, as I say, I've shown this in order to demonstrate this first particular insight, which is that we can make often complex or surprising or seemingly illogical judgments or decisions or behaviours. And so the first particular challenge that behavioural science throws up to us in terms of translating insights and approaches to market research is, if behaviour is often complex, what new or what types of insights and approaches and methods do we actually need to best get to grips with this complexity? So that's sort of insight and challenge 1. Insight 2 is that often research participants are unaware of some of these more complex and surprising things that impact on their behaviour, and so they're not necessarily able to tell us about them. And so this presents a second key challenge to us, which is that if there are things that research participants can't tell us about, are there any methods, or what methods can we use to try and get deeper under the skin, so we can try and get closer to the truth, if you like, and uncover everything about what's driving their behaviour, even those bits they can't tell us about. And as I mentioned at the start, quantitative research is particularly useful to us to tackle both of these challenges, in particular the second of those two. And so this is what I'm going to focus on for the next sort of half an hour or so. As I mentioned, the first key area I'm going to talk about is behaviour change models. So in all of these sections, what I'm going to start with is a definition, and then I'm going to move on to show a couple of real-life case studies and examples of this stuff in action. So what is a model? So first of all, a model describes the operation or mechanism of something. It describes how something works. And as I mentioned up front, even if we don't necessarily want to change behaviour at the end of a research project, behaviour change models can nevertheless be very useful to us in helping us to generate and test hypotheses about what might be driving behaviour currently. That's sort of the first of the key kind of positives, if you like, about behaviour change models. And as I say, there's an example in a couple of slides' time about how we would set up and test hypotheses. Behaviour change models, I've found, can also be very helpful to us in terms of structuring our findings. So I found when we go back to clients and present findings within the context of a recognised and established behaviour change model, it can really help clients to better understand those findings and indeed question those findings, as opposed to presenting necessarily sort of a list of observations or generic kind of findings that we think might fit together somehow, but we're not quite sure how. And lastly, as I say, we might want to, we don't have to, but we might want to also use these at the end of a project to recommend, generate, or even potentially test what we call interventions, which are actions that we can take to change behaviour. So how do we start using this stuff? Well, there are many models out there, and some of them are useful in some situations and not others. The one I'm going to talk you through today, and as I say, I'm going to present a couple of examples shortly, is what's known as the COM-B model, which I'm sure some of you will at least be aware of. So the COM-B model was developed at the University College London by synthesising findings from 19 different behaviour change frameworks. So in terms of its sort of academic credibility and evidence-based, it's very strong. And it's also, as I've kind of found from using it, it's very flexible to use in a number of different scenarios. And I guess the one sentence summary of the COM-B model is, effectively, if we want somebody to do a particular behaviour, they need to have the capability, they need to have the opportunity, and they need to have the motivation. So they need all three of those things in order to do a particular behaviour. So before I show a couple of case studies and examples of how I've used this model quantitatively, I just wanted to touch on briefly, what do I mean by capability, opportunity, and motivation? So first of all, capability, this can mean one of two things. It can mean the physical capability, such as the physical strength or the physical stamina or the physical skills to do a particular behaviour. More often than not, however, it turns out to be the psychological knowledge or the psychological skills. A lot of the time in research projects we work on, we need to sort of work out, is it the psychological or is it the physical capability that people need in order to do a particular behaviour. However, as well as capability, people also need the opportunity to do a particular behaviour. So this, again, can typically mean two things. It can first mean they need a conducive physical environment. So, for example, they need the time to do a behaviour, or they need the money to do a behaviour. But it can also mean having a conducive social environment, so that behaviour being socially acceptable. And last of all, once they've got the capability and opportunity, they also need the motivation. They need sufficiently strong motivation to do the behaviour at the particular time in question. And so motivation is where things like perceptions and beliefs come in. So perceptions that this behaviour would be a worthwhile behaviour would sit under motivation. And lastly, motivation also, it covers sort of things like impulses and reflexes. So this is about kind of how people got sufficiently strong motivation at that particular point in time i.e. are they not distracted by other needs, wants, impulses or reflexes? The last thing to mention about the model that I'll come back to deliberately in a couple of slides' time is these different arrows that we can see on the left-hand side. Let's just for now just kind of summarise this as we need capability, opportunity, and motivation. But how do we actually go about applying this model in practice? So in each of the 3 chapters I'm going to talk through today, I'm going to present a sort of a basic approach, and then I'm going to present a more advanced approach. So if we start with the basic approach here, the most basic way we can apply this model is through inserting an agreement scale question in a typical quantitative questionnaire. So to give you an example, so in a recent study I was working on, we wanted to work out physicians, this was physicians, the barriers to prescribing a particular treatment to patients. And the way we went about sort of incorporating COM-B into this is that we use COM-B to generate, alongside prior research that the clients had done, we use COM-B to generate and classify hypotheses as to these different types of barriers that may or may not be impacting or stopping them from doing the behaviour we wanted them to do. So in simple terms, this was effectively all we did. So we asked the question in the quant survey, to what extent would you need each of the following in order to prescribe this treatment X more than you currently do? And as we can see, what I've done with this is we've sort of flagged up each of these types of barriers from prior research, and we've classified each of those under one of those 3 key areas, so capability, opportunity, or motivation. And if we look at the results, what we can see is that indeed all 3 types of factor are shown to be important to at least half of the sample. So 67% believe it would achieve, they want to believe that this treatment would achieve significantly better outcomes than other treatments for their patients. So 67% are picking this motivation factor. However, 54% are also saying they need to know the product was reimbursed, which is an opportunity factor. And lastly, 51%, again, just over half the sample, are saying they need to know more about the clinical benefits, which we can see from the red colouring is a capability factor. So hopefully this is quite a nice illustration of each of the 3 elements or pillars of COM-B needing to be there in order to do a particular behaviour. And indeed, I guess one of the key things I found with this particular model, but also other models, is, as I say, that they can provide a structure for helping you to categorise and identify and test particular hypotheses that may or may not be driving behaviour or indeed inhibiting behaviour. And so these type of models can also help us to sort of steer clear of making potentially incorrect assumptions about behaviour, or indeed missing out potentially important factors altogether. And the last, I guess, key thing to talk about on this slide is that one of the questions that comes up quite a lot, I find, is that agencies often sort of in their surveys, they get, particularly with new products, they get very high appeal or high intention to treat or high intention to purchase. And often that doesn't translate to high product uptake when the product comes onto the market. And what I found is that behaviour change models like this can be very helpful in sort of helping to explain to clients, look, it's not just about kind of motivation, appeal, PI type of factors. We also need to kind of ask about these other factors like capability and opportunity as well. So hopefully you can see how this particular kind of way of using models can help us to try and get to grips with some of the complexity of human behaviour, and as I say, try and sort of help us to steer clear of some of the maybe more incorrect assumptions that we might make or potential omissions that we might make about human behaviour. However, what about that second key challenge I talked about? What about this thing that there's many factors that research participants are not even necessarily able to tell us about? So how can these models help with this? I mentioned a couple of slides ago, the COM-B model contains these arrows, which effectively describe the relationships between the 3 key pillars of COM-B. This is what I call interconnecting influences. So what we have here is, it's not, yes, we need capability and opportunity and motivation, but also the model describes how, for example, capability drives motivation. So, for example, the theory is the better you become at something, the more capable you become at something, the more motivated you are to do that. And so knowledge of these relationships can help us get to grips with some of the slightly more deeper drivers of behaviour that participants themselves might not necessarily be able to tell us about. So to give you an example, again, a physician study, very similar type of study where we wanted to get a better understanding of the types of factors that may drive or indeed inhibit prescription of particular treatments. And so what we did in this study, again quantitative, was to not ask the sort of what would make you do this type of question we asked in the previous slide, but instead to ask about current levels of capability, opportunity and motivation with regards to the particular client's treatment. So for example, under capability, we asked things like, to what extent do you feel knowledgeable about the efficacy aspects of this particular treatment? Under motivation, we asked things like, to what extent do you feel comfortable or relaxed in prescribing this particular treatment? And what we found through a little bit of statistical analysis was that many of these relationships between the pillars of COM-B were held up by the data, and indeed some of them were very, very strong. So, for example, one key thing that came through was that knowledge of the particular treatment, which comes under the capability pillar, was very, very highly connected or correlated to comfort or relaxation in prescribing. And so this is a kind of an example of the types of things that research participants might not necessarily be aware of, but through quantitative analysis, we're able to get at. And lastly, on this particular project, we were also, the client in this case was very interested in creating change. We were able to kind of take things a step further and say, well, for example, if knowledge levels drive comfort levels, if you want to increase motivation towards your new treatment, a very effective way to do that could be through increasing capability. That's the first of the three key chapters on behavioural change models. So just to briefly summarise, I've talked about how change models can help us identify current behavioural influences and indeed kind of test potential hypotheses about what might be driving behaviour. And this can help us to get to grips with some of the more detailed complexities of human behaviour. I've also talked about how these types of models, particularly quantitatively, can help us get to grips with some of those deeper factors of which people may be unaware and therefore unable to tell us about. So moving on to section 3 on behavioural economics. Again, let's sort of start this chapter with the definition. So what is behavioural economics? Again, so basically to keep things pretty simple, I tend to use a very similar wording, which is around the Obama example of understanding how people make decisions and act on them. However, behavioural economics is sort of a bit more narrow in terms of the types of situations it deals with. It typically deals with more economic situations. Now, behavioural economics, I think it's fair to say, has been responsible for much of the insights around how complex and surprising and indeed seemingly illogical some of our behaviours can be. So behavioural economics has sort of helped to present, I guess, one of these key challenges that I talked about up front. However, behavioural economics has also helped us by providing a language by which we can get to grips with and investigate some of these more complex drivers of behaviour. And the way it's helping us to do this is through two things which are known as heuristics and biases, which are both have key and significant impacts on our behaviour. So first of all, a heuristic is essentially a shortcut rule of thumb that we often use in more complex situations to try and make the decision more simple. And heuristics, as I said, they're used a lot of the time, and much of the time they lead to good acts for people. However, they can sometimes lead to what are known as cognitive biases, which are systematic errors in decision making. And indeed, it's the area of sort of cognitive biases that sort of that can lead to these illogical behaviours that I think has probably been picked up quite a lot, particularly in the qualitative space by researchers over the last decade or so. And the reason for that is that there are literally hundreds of biases that have been identified by behavioural economists. So in terms of providing us with this opportunity to investigate the full depth and complexity of human behaviour, there are lots of different potential biases that we can look into that may be driving behaviour in any particular situation. Again, let's look at a sort of a basic approach first of all. So how would we go about identifying the existence of one of these many cognitive biases in quantitative research? So to take an example, so a sort of fairly well-known cognitive bias is what's known as risk aversion. And this is where people essentially, a lot of the time, they tend to prefer outcomes with lower levels of uncertainty, even if that means potentially missing out on a bigger reward. So to give you a brief illustration of how we might identify this particular cognitive bias quantitatively. So this is, again, taken from a physician study. So this is where we asked 100 physicians, how would you describe your approach to trying new treatments using the following scale? So a 7-point scale. And as we can see, if we sum the top 3 boxes and the bottom 3 boxes, we get 52% who say they prefer to wait a while before trying new treatment approaches, versus just 28% who describe themselves as being among the first to try new treatment approaches. So not everybody is risk averse, but we can see there's quite a high instance of risk aversion within this particular population. And this can present challenges to uptake, for example, in this case, of this new treatment. So regardless of what people say, for example, about the appeal of a particular treatment or their intention to use it, many of these factors, like, for example, risk aversion, can, when it comes to the real world, can present significant challenges to product uptake. And so in this type of study, I will often kind of ask this type of question alongside the more sort of product specific appeal, intention to purchase, intention to treat type of questions. So hopefully you can see this is a pretty straightforward way, and as I say, there's lots and lots of cognitive biases out there that we can build into our quantitative projects. However, as I mentioned at the start, the second key challenge that behavioural science throws up is that there are many factors of which people are unaware, which drive their behaviour, and unfortunately, a fair number of these many cognitive biases fall under this bracket of being things that people are not necessarily aware of. So the previous example, people are typically aware and happy to report on their levels of risk aversion. But there are many, as I say, different cognitive biases that can be very influential that people are not necessarily aware of. So to give you a quick example, so I'm sure many of you have heard of this thing called unconscious bias, where we can be, our judgments can be informed by the physical or personal characteristics of people without us necessarily being aware that we're doing so. And there's many different studies out there that illustrate unconscious bias. So for example, this pain medication study, this was a study in the US where physicians were shown to be influenced by the race of the patient, and to give white patients treatments with significantly higher doses than they were to Black or Latino patients, again, without necessarily being aware that's what they were doing. And so the existence of these types of biases that people or research participants are not necessarily aware of presents, again, challenges for us in both the quant and the qual space. So let's take qual first. So first of all, in the qual space, in a sort of typical qual scenario, we effectively hit a bit of a dead end here. So there's many things qualitatively, biases that people are aware of, such as risk aversion, that we can talk about, we can identify, we can read between the lines on. However, there are, as I say, many like unconscious bias that people are not aware of, and in some cases also, even if they are aware of them, not necessarily happy to report those to a researcher. So in a qual sort of space, we typically kind of hit the end of the road here. There's not much we can do about things like unconscious bias other than potentially trying to infer things like that from what people are telling us. However, in the quant space, the good news is that there are techniques to identify some of these harder to unearth factors. So to give you an illustration of how we might tackle one of these or identify one of these in a quant sample, I'm going to focus on a particular, again, a different cognitive bias called overconfidence. Now, again, this is pretty much as it sounds. This is where we exhibit higher levels of confidence in our abilities than our abilities should actually suggest. And indeed, the sort of classic illustration that comes up a lot of overconfidence is about driving. How I think sort of 80-something% of us say we're better than average drivers, which of course can't actually be true. And so the way we would go about identifying something like overconfidence, as I say, that people are less aware of, is through what we call the randomized controlled trials or split sample approach. Again, taking another physician example, this is where we asked a question to, again, 100 different physicians, and we said, what percentage of all antibiotic prescriptions written in the last month would you say were clinically justified? And what we did here, sort of similarly, if we think way back to the kind of TV license example right at the start of the presentation, is that we asked a slightly different question to one half of the sample versus the other half of the sample. So first of all, one half of the sample were asked about their own personal behaviour. What percentage of your personal antibiotic prescriptions in the last month were clinically justified? The other half of the sample were asked about their own practice, so to include other physicians within their practice, not just their own. And what we can see from the results on the left-hand side is that there is a high incidence of overconfidence in this sample. So what we can see is that 80% in green, 80% of people's own prescriptions, they judge them to be clinically justified. However, only 58% of prescriptions within the own practice were judged to be clinically justified. So again, a highly statistically significant difference, which illustrates this overconfidence bias. And again, you know, alongside the other many things like, for example, risk aversion I talked about, this type of thing can present significant challenges when it comes to adoption of products in the real world. So whatever, as I say, whatever people are saying about the appeal or the purchase intent or any of those types of things like risk aversion and overconfidence in their current ways of doing things can indeed present significant challenges when it comes to real world adoption. So that was the second section on behavioural economics. So just briefly summarising, so I talked about how behavioural economics is about some of these more subtle influences like heuristics and biases that can have a key influence on our behaviour, and how, first of all, this language and this framework of heuristics and biases can present us with significant opportunities to better get to grips with the complexities of human behaviour. However, the sort of caveat to that, as I say, is that many of these biases in particular are things that people are not necessarily aware of or able to tell us about. And so in particular, quantitatively can help us to help to unearth some of these harder to reach influences through methods such as, for example, the randomized control trials or split sample approach. And then the last section to talk through is around personality psychology. One or two of you may remember I did a webinar on this a few months ago, where I was able to go into quite a lot more detail than I'm able to go into today on personality psychology. So if people want to see the slides afterwards, I put the link on this particular page to a recording of the previous personality psychology webinar I did. However, I've sort of condensed it down to pick out the key points of that webinar for this last section of today's webinar. Again, let's start the final section with a definition. So what actually is personality? And again, the sort of fairly simple definition I like to use is personality is our general tendency to behave consistently across situations. And there are 4 key properties of personalities that make them very useful to us if we want to get to grips with complexity of human behaviour and delve deeper. But the first positive and really good thing about personalities is that they are distinct. So there are lots of different ways in which all of us are similar to each other, but there are also lots of ways in which we are different to one another. And research has shown that these kind of differences can lead, particularly when we sort of track people over time, to very different patterns of judgment and decision making across different individuals. So they're really good at differentiating people. The second sort of good thing about personalities is that they are typically stable. So there's lots of interesting research about how personalities change over time. However, in the short and medium term, they tend to be very stable, which means that they're useful sort of things for us to collect, particularly when we talk about things like segmentations, for example. The third positive thing about personalities is that when it comes to extracting personality trait information from market research respondents, people typically tend to self-report in an accurate and unbiased way. So I'll talk briefly, shortly, about sort of different ways in which we can collect personality trait information. But if we use what have been kind of put together by academics as very sort of established and recognised personality trait questions, we tend to find that there's typically no real right or wrong answer, and so people do tend to give accurate and unbiased self-reports when we ask these types of questions. And then the last thing, which is probably the biggest positive of all, is that personality traits have been shown across many different situations to powerfully both explain and predict behaviour. So they're really good things to capture. How do we actually go about representing and indeed capturing personality trait information? Now, as you probably guessed, in academia, as usual, there's lots of different models and lots of different approaches for collecting personality trait information. However, the one that's most established in academia and indeed in the real world is what's known as the OCEAN or Big Five framework. So this typically sort of focuses on 5 key traits. So these are on the left-hand side. So these are openness to experience, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and what they call neuroticism. And similarly to the previous slide, there's sort of 4 key sort of positive things that I want to kind of highlight about this particular way of representing personality traits. So the first positive thing is that these traits within the OCEAN framework are collected on a spectrum. So typically we'll ask people, on a 7-point scale or a 10-point scale, where they sit on a number of different statements, and they're given the opportunity to be anywhere between high and low. And the reason this is such a good thing is that some of the personality models out there, such as, for example, the Myers-Briggs test, are a lot less flexible, and they, for example, people have to sit, for example, as extrovert only or introvert only. There's no nuance that this particular spectrum of OCEAN provides. The second positive thing about the OCEAN framework is that everything in here, these key 5 traits, have been shown to be heritable. So there's a strong genetic basis to each of these key 5 things. They're not just things that sort of data analysis has thrown up to be important. The third key thing about the OCEAN framework is that when you collect OCEAN information from people, it's very reliable, by which I mean, if you take an OCEAN test one day and then take it a week later, you are very likely to receive a similar or indeed exactly the same personality trait summary, which kind of sounds obvious and you would hope this would be the case. But again, things like Myers-Briggs have been shown to be pretty unreliable. I think about 1 in 2 people get a different Myers-Briggs profile when they take the test a second time when compared to the first time. And the last great thing to highlight about this framework is that for any of us, as I'm sure there will be, that do international research, these 5 traits have been shown to be to exist and indeed to be consistent across many different cultures, not just Western cultures. So these 5 traits exist across African cultures and Asian cultures and North American cultures. And indeed, many of the different sort of, I haven't got time to go into this today, but many of the different sort of things we see, patterns, for example, we see differences between, for example, males and females on different personality traits. They're indeed consistent across different cultures. So lastly, before I give a couple of quick examples on this, the obvious question is, how do we actually collect this information? And as I say, we typically use agree, disagree scale questions, and there's many academic sort of recognised, recommended questions to use. The one, if we're particularly for shorter space, is very useful, is what's called the 10-item personality inventory, which I put the link to here. So if we want the most full possible understanding of people's ocean profile, we need to ask a lot more than 10 questions. However, the 10-question cut-down survey is obviously much more pragmatic and indeed captures most of what the longer 60-question questionnaire captures. So first of all, again, let's look at a basic approach of this in action before looking at a more advanced approach. So, as I mentioned, one of the key positives about personalities is that people, if we ask them in using these academically validated scales, people will respond to these questions in an accurate and unbiased way. And so the most basic way we can kind of use this in quantitative research is we can ask people about certain traits that we know from academic research are important drivers of behaviour in that particular situation. So to give you an example, taking from the ocean framework, the C, conscientiousness, and the E, extroversion. Conscientiousness and extroversion have been shown to be very good predictors of physical activity. So, for example, we were doing a study on how to drive sports participation, for example. It would be a very useful thing to ask people about their levels of conscientiousness and extroversion. And indeed, as I mentioned earlier, segmentations are a particularly, in the quantitative space, particularly a good area to apply this stuff in, given the kind of, as I say, that people will accurately and unbiasedly report on them, but also, as I mentioned earlier, these traits can be very stable or are very stable over time. So a segmentation involving personality traits is likely to stay useful for a large period of time. However, the last sort of slide in terms of how we'd use this stuff in the advanced approach, what if we weren't necessarily happy to take these academic insights as gospel? So, for example, if we didn't want to take it as read that conscientiousness and extroversion indeed did predict physical activity, what if we wanted to actually test that ourselves and make sure it was correct? So, as I mentioned, as I say, people will accurately and unbiasedly self-report on personality traits. However, they won't necessarily see the link between, for example, conscientiousness and extroversion and their likelihood to do physical activity. And again, this is where quantitative research really sort of comes into its own, is that we can ask about many different things, and we can sort of analyze the relationships between different things. So to give you a last example, this is a quant example where it was a health consumer study, and the client wanted to get a better understanding of how we could drive uptake of this particular product, because it hadn't been doing very well. And the particular lens we sort of wanted to find on this was of personality traits. Were personality traits potentially stopping the take-up of this particular product? And one of the key hypotheses we had is that something called anticipated regret was stopping or reducing uptake of this particular product. So anticipated regret is something where we act or often don't act in order to minimize the potential regret we might feel having made the wrong decision further down the line. And again, the academic evidence shows that anticipated regret is a very powerful predictor of health behavior. However, in this particular project, what we wanted to do is test whether that actually was the case or not. So what we did is, in the quant survey, collected around about half a dozen, as I say, sort of academically validated statements, agree, disagree statements, to capture this construct of anticipated regret. And we captured those alongside product behaviours and product perceptions. And when we did the analysis, what we found is that product perceptions were not massively correlated with product behaviours. However, some of the personality traits, and in particular this anticipated regret personality trait that we tested, were highly predictive of behaviour. And again, hopefully you can see that this is a kind of slightly more subtle thing that participants themselves might not necessarily be aware of, this connection between regret and their behaviour in this particular scenario if we ask them in a more direct way. So hopefully you can see how kind of asking them in this more quantitative, slightly more indirect way has helped to sort of bring up insights that are kind of less obvious and that participants are less likely to have come up with in a direct way. So briefly summing up the personality chapter. So as I say, personality traits, their key kind of selling point is this ability to explain and predict behaviour. And as I say, with the first challenge I talked about up front about embracing and understanding this human complexity, they can provide a very useful lens into that complexity. And lastly, as I say, if we apply this stuff quantitatively, it can also help us to get to grips with some of these factors, like anticipated regret, that people are less likely to attribute to certain behaviours that they're doing or not doing, but which we can incorporate into our quant surveys in particular, and use statistical analysis to test. So that's the end of the presentation. Just to wrap up, so I obviously talked about the great challenges of behavioural science, that it forces us to kind of think about, well, how can we best tackle this complexity? What approaches can we use? And indeed, what approaches can we use to get deeper under the skin of those things that participants are less aware of? And I've talked obviously through the three key chapters of behaviour change models, behavioural economics, and personality traits. Lastly, a couple of sort of promo slides. So as Sally mentioned at the start, I've recently released a sort of full guide on applications of behavioural science specifically to quant market research. So this contains everything I've talked about today, but also quite a bit more detail on all of these three areas, but particularly the first of the three key chapters on behaviour change models. So if anybody wants to get a free copy of that, please go to my website and just fill in the form on the right hand side there. Alternatively, if everybody, if 35 pages is too much for everybody, I've also recently released a much shorter guide of little sort of takeaway soundbite articles around applying behavioural science in both qualitative and quantitative market research. So that's another publication that, if you want to, please go onto my website and request that for free, and I'll send it over. But without further ado, if anybody's got any questions, thanks very much for your time, and look forward to hearing them.
That was absolutely fantastic. Thank you so much, Chris. And very practical examples of how you can apply it. We don't have very much time left. I don't know if anybody has any questions. I can't see any at the moment in the question or chat box. But failing that, I do have a question. If we have just a few minutes, could you give me an example of a regret statement that you would test? And then if you identify an issue through the regret statements, how do you potentially address that from a marketing perspective? Is it something that marketeers could adjust their strategy to try and overcome those regrets, or is it just something to avoid those target markets?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thanks, Sally. Sorry, I'm just leafing through to try and find a specific example. I can't think of the exact wording off the top of my head, but it will be around sort of I typically once I've made a decision, I like to go back and see how the other alternatives turned out. That type of thing. There's sorry, I don't have the exact wording on me, but those types of things to kind of ask people to look to sort of talk about what they did after the decision, and whether they went back to reconsider it, or to see how other other approaches they might have taken turned out. In terms of marketing, how
would you apply that? How would you use that learning?
Yeah, so the example I talked about the sort of health tech medical devices, one of the key insights of the client was this is less an issue about providing people with more information, and this is more an issue of reassurance. So that at a sort of very high level, that would be sort of, you know, what one thing approach we would take to try and tackle that. So to focus our communications less on telling people more about the specific XYZ benefits of the product, and more trying to help sort of guide them in a sort of more kind of reassuring manner through the process.
Okay, that's great. Still no questions, but I think we're pretty much out of time anyway, so probably it just remains to say thank you very much, Chris, and also thank you so much for allowing us to access all this information, free information that's available through your website. So that's a real bonus. So thank you very much for delivering this really interesting talk today, and thanks to everybody for logging in. I hope you found it useful, and do come back and watch another webinar from the ICG in the future. Thanks again, Chris. Bye, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.